Well, let's get started back. We're going to finish talking about Ozark legends and folktales. Mostly Ozark folktales is what we've got left to discuss, and we'll read a few of the folktales. Before we do, we will take a look, and we're counting on Butch to identify our famous Ozarker of the day, and somebody else. If you watch what is it, TV Land or something like that, you've probably seen this guy before. Chester. He's not dressed as Chester here, but does anybody know who this guy is? Anybody besides Butch? You got one of his characters, probably his best known TV character, right? Has anybody ever seen Gunsmoke? The old, he would have been, I guess, back in the black and white days of Gunsmoke. He played Chester on Gunsmoke. And this is a character I don't really remember Gunsmoke. It probably went off the air when I was about 5 or 6 years old. But I do remember this TV show. That was his character from the 70s. It was a show called McCloud. Yeah. You remember that? In
New York City or somewhere.
Yeah. Yeah, he was a country. It was kind of Crocodile Dundee in the 70s. He was a country guy who was a detective or a cop or something in the big city. But the guy's name, and the reason we've got him up, Dennis Weaver. He passed away a few years ago, and he was from Joplin. We talked about the spook light, and Weaver was quite an accomplished guy. You can see there, for several years was a TV star from the 50s into the 70s, and even before that, he was quite an accomplished guy. Was a World War II veteran, and had been a college track star, I believe, at the University of Oklahoma, where he was a track star. So quite an interesting guy, Dennis Weaver. The museum, the History Museum over at Joplin, has a few Dennis Weaver items. I think they have like one of the scripts from Gunsmoke or McCloud or one of those TV shows over there that belonged to him, that he had donated to the museum. And so quite an interesting guy. When we talk about swan as our Ozarks vocabulary word for the day, we're not talking about the bird. This is a verb. Anybody ever heard this term?
Swan song.
No. It's this as in someone saying, "Well, I'll swan." Anybody ever heard that? I swan. I'll swear. You know, that kind of thing. That's what a lot of old timers in the Ozarks use that phrase instead of "I swear." I swan or I'll swan. I'll say to my time. Lots of exclamations you could put in there. So that's our sentence for the day. I swan, Arlene. Can't you go to town without buying another play pretty for that youngin' of yourn? Lots of good stuff in that one. What do you think a play pretty is?
A toy.
From the context, yeah, from that context, you got it right. It's a toy. Yeah, a play pretty is a toy. Yeah, I can remember my grandmother always called toys play pretties.
Called what?
Play pretties. Yeah. You would think toy is a 3-letter word. It's one syllable. It'd be easier just to say toy, but you know they were play pretties. So we got Dennis Weaver and swan, I'll swan, and play pretty. Let's talk a little bit about Ozark Folktales. Now, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of these, if not most, folktales are actually told as the truth, or the tellers believe that they're telling the truth or some sort of version of the truth. Lacey's grandpa thought that a hoop snake was a hoop snake. Now the horned hoop snake, that was another issue, but a lot of these folk tales, as you'll see, when Randolph collected these and published these, he took out a lot of names because a lot of people would tell these stories, old so-and-so from down the road, his great-grandparents or this and that. And a lot of these had names in them, had places in them. And the people who told them for the truth. Now, some of them probably did contain some truth, and some of them didn't. Some of them, as we'll see, were folk tales in the sense that they sort of told a moral. They may not, even the tellers probably didn't believe that they were true. When you get stories about the three pigs and Jack and the cornstalk in the Ozarks and stuff like that, people weren't telling those for the truth. But some of the folk tales they believed were true. A few of the ones, I don't know of any of the ones that we'll read tonight, are genuinely regional in origin, possibly so. But most of the folk tales had some sort of European origins. They had come out of European traditions, and it was, as we'll see when we look at versions of them, I think we'll look at an Ozark version of the three little pigs, and the Jacktails, most famously Jack and the Beanstalk, or Jack and the cornstalk in the Ozarks, and all of these had roots in Europe somewhere, came out of that storytelling tradition, that folktale tradition. And again, all of these stories that we're going to be talking about today come from one book, and this one's called Who Blowed Up the Church House by Vance Randolph, and it came out in the 50s. And in the 1950s, Randolph published a series of these folktale books. They're basically collections of folk tales that he had heard in the many years that he lived and worked in the Ozarks. And this was just one of them. There's one called Sticks in the Knapsack, and there are lots of these. The Talking Turtle, I believe, is another one. But there are a lot of these folktale books, and most of them were published in the 50s, and they were very popular. A lot of the tales had sexual undertones, if not overtones, in them. And he cleaned up the ones that came out in the 50s, but later in the 1970s, he published a collection of very dirty folk tales, very bawdy folk tales called Pissing in the Snow. And that one, not surprisingly, that one is still in print. Of all the folktale books, the older ones, the cleaned up ones, are not in print anymore, but the dirty one is still in print and still probably a bestseller today. But we didn't use that one, but we are going to read a few of the short folk tales from Who Blowed Up the Church House. And I encourage you to check out the other books that Randolph did. Now there's a different picture of Randolph than we've seen before, a serious sort of Randolph. Some of the stories are macabre stories. They're dark, as we mentioned earlier, very similar to the folk songs, the folk ballads that we talked about earlier in the semester that had to do with death and dismemberment and stuff like that. And we'll take a look at a couple of those just to give you an idea of what we're talking about when we talk about these folk tales. And to keep in mind that all of these stories were collected from people in the Ozarks. He collected all of these in southern Missouri or northern Arkansas somewhere. And in his collections, you can go to the back of the books, and he's got a little note section for each story that tells who he collected it from and where and the date and all that kind of stuff. And he will give you similar other stories that have been collected in the United States and in Europe and published and things like that. But this one's called The Boy That Fooled His Folks. And this is a very common theme, a motif that you'll probably recognize. You may not have heard a story exactly like it, but it's the kind of story that would show up in one of those old ballads and that kind of thing. It says, one time there was a man and his wife lived beside the river, and so they run a ferry. Sometimes travelers would stay at their house all night. They never had no children except one boy, and he run off when he was 10 years old, and that was a long time ago. So then one evening a young fellow come through town, and he stopped at a store. He was riding a good horse, and he wore good clothes and a white hat. He had a gold watch and chain and rings on his fingers. He says to the storekeeper, "Don't you know me?" The storekeeper says no, so then the young fellow told who he was and asked about his pa and ma. The storekeeper says they are all right and they are still running the ferry, same as ever. Well, the young fellow says he's going down there and stay all night. He says he'll not tell the folks who he is till tomorrow, and he'll give his pa and ma a lot of money out of his saddlebags. So then the young feller went off down the river road. A couple days after this, the old man that run the ferry come over to get him some tobacco, and the storekeeper says, "Well, you must be having a big time at your house now that your boy is home." Then the storekeeper told how the young fella had been there and how he was aiming to pass himself off for a stranger and how he was so he could fool his pa and ma and give them a lot of money out of the saddlebags. The old man didn't say nothing, and pretty soon he went home. The next day the old woman killed herself, and they found her hanging to a rafter in the barn. Get a little dark at this point. The old man never amounted to much after that. Sometimes he would just lay under a tree all day. People come along and blowed the horn and wanted to be set across the river, but he didn't pay them no mind. Just before the old man died, he told the storekeeper how it happened. "It was my boy come to our place that night," says he, "but me and Ma didn't know him. There was gold and silver in them saddlebags, so Ma, she cut his throat and we buried him under the chicken house." I can imagine telling that one around the fireplace at night, to the kids. Yeah, maybe this is not exactly the prodigal son story, come back in welcoming arms, but there's probably some kind of message in that story. Maybe don't run off from home. Don't sneak around. Tell people who you are, that kind of stuff. I'm not sure. I'm just trying to search for some kind of moral in an otherwise dark and dreary story. But this is an example of one of the dark, macabre stories. This one is Little House on the Prairie light compared to Pennywinkle, though. Well, and that's a short one that we'll look at, if I can find it in here. Another one of the dark ones. One time there was a woman who got mad at her husband about something, so she killed their baby with a fire shovel. That's quite a first sentence to start off the story with. Then she skinned the baby just like a rabbit and cut it up just like a rabbit and cooked it just like a rabbit. When her man come home that night, she set the meat on the table. Him and her was not speaking, so he didn't ask nobody what kind of meat it was. He sat down and ate every scrap of the meat, and the woman sent her daughter to put the bones under a marble stone down by the spring house. Nobody said a word all evening, so pretty soon they went to bed, but they couldn't get no sleep. It seemed like something was a-crawling around in the house and crying. After a while, the man, he says, "Who's there? What do you want?" And then a little ghost hollered back, "Pennywinkle, Pennywinkle, my ma killed me, my pa ate me, my sister buried my bones under a marble stone. I want my liver and lights and whiny pipes, Pennywinkle, Pennywinkle." And when the fellow heard this, he got to thinking about what it meant. So after a while, he got out of bed and went down to the spring house and found the baby's bones under the marble stone. Well, the man sat there a while and whetted up his knife. Then he went back to the house and cut his wife's head off. The stepdaughter, she run away through the woods, and nobody ever did find out what become of her. The folks took the baby's head and skin and bones out from under the marble and put them in a regular little coffin and buried them in the graveyard. And that's the end of the Pennywinkle story. So
these are stories he heard.
These are stories that
He didn't write them.
no, he didn't make these up. These,
Paraphrase them or-
right, these are stories, and both of these stories have European origins. He was able to connect, both of these stories with similar sorts of stories that would have been told in European folktale traditions. The type and folklorists who arrange these into types and motifs and all that kind of stuff, the type is actually referred to as "my mother slew me, my father ate me." I mean, there are enough stories that's a type of story. I mean, what were our ancestors doing anyhow? Aren't you glad to be in the 21st century? We're talking about how dangerous things are today, but I don't think we tell our kids stories like this. At least I hope that's not what the Disney Channel's doing, when it's babysitting our kids for us. I'm not sure. But that's, and then one more, and this is another one that has direct antecedents in European folktale tradition, if I can find that. It's called The Little Blue Ball, and this is the last, I think, really dark one we'll talk about. It says, one time there was 3 girls in a cabin, and the biggest one went out to sweep the front yard. A little blue ball rode off the roof and down the hill. So the biggest girl followed it and come to a great big house with a stranger sitting on the porch. He told her to sweep the whole house except one room, and he says for her not to look in that room. But of course she done it anyhow while the stranger was gone, and she got some blood on her leg. It wouldn't wash off neither, no matter how hard she rubbed it. There was a little dog come along just then, and the little dog asked her to give him some bread and butter. We got talking animals, so that adds a new element for us. But she says, "Get out, I won't give you no bread and butter." Pretty soon the stranger come home. He seen the blood on her leg, and he knowed where she'd been. So he cut her head off and throwed her in the room. Lots of head cutting off in these stories. The next day, the middle-sized girl went out to sweep the front yard, and she seen the little blue ball and followed it to the big house and got blood on her leg and wouldn't give the little dog no bread and butter. And when the stranger come home, he knowed where she had been, so he cut her head off and throwed her in the room. On the third day, the least girl, the smallest girl, went out to sweep the front yard, and she seen the little blue ball and followed it to the big house and got blood on her leg just like the other girls. But when the little dog come along, she give him all the bread and butter he could eat, and so he licked the blood off. And when the stranger come home, he didn't see no blood on her leg. So he married the least girl right away, and everything turned out fine after all. I'm not sure I would say it turned out fine after all, but whatever the storyteller thinks, this is another very common type of story. It's of the type called rescue of their sister. Now, in this case, this Ozark version, the 2 deceased sisters are not rescued, obviously. In some other versions of the story, the sisters are only imprisoned until the young one comes and marries the stranger and saves them. Or in some of them, they're brought back to life magically when the young one does this. But again, that's a common enough story, a common enough theme that it's actually a type of story in that kind of European American folktale tradition. Not quite as pretty dark, but not quite as dark. At least this one supposedly has a happy ending. Though today in the 21st century, we may have to strain to really see the happy ending in all of this. But a couple of good examples. I'll read just a couple of the so-called Jacktails. And the Jacktails are there's a whole genre of Jacktails. There are books written about Jacktails. And these have to do with a boy named Jack. It's not always the same character, but it's always somebody named Jack or whatever name that area typically uses. And it's they're stories like Jack and the Beanstalk that have Jack getting into some predicament. Sometimes Jack is foolish and does stupid stuff. In one of the cases we'll see here, Jack is just not a very smart guy, and it's a humorous story. And that's the first one we'll read is called Jack Couldn't Make No Change, if I can find the page number for it here. This one's a little bit. This is a little bit longer, but it gives you an insight into Ozark humor, kind of a subtle kind of Ozark humor that's still very funny today, but it's a humor that you have to kind of pay close attention to and figure out what's going on. It says, one time there was a feller named Jack, and he heired a lot of money when his folks died off. He inherited a lot of money. But he didn't have much sense, so he went into town and bought him a saloon. So I guess, if you go to town and buy a saloon, that means you don't have much sense. The first day he run the saloon, there was a town fella come in, and he says, give me some whiskey. Jack set him out a glass of whiskey and says, that'll be 15 cents. But the town fella says 15 cents is too much, and he'll take three beers instead because beers only cost a nickel. So Jack poured the whiskey back in the bottle and gave him 3 beers. The town fella drank the beers, and then he started out. Jack says, you owe me 15 cents for them 3 beers. And the town fella says, how do you figure that? Didn't I trade you the whiskey for them beers? Jack, he says, yes, but you never paid me for the whiskey. The town fella says, of course not, because I never drank the whiskey. You poured it back in the bottle. I seen you with my own eyes, and I'll swear to it in court. And then the town fella went out the door. Jack, he sat there a long time studying about it and counting his money. He knowed he was 15 cents short, but he couldn't figure out how the town fella done it so slick. The next day, there was 2 town fellas come in, and one of them bought a glass of beer. He throwed a $1 bill on the bar, and Jack gave him 95 cents change. Just then, the other fellow says, here, I want a beer too, and both of them is on me. Give my friend his $1 back and take him out of this. And he throwed a silver dollar on the bar. So Jack give the first fellow his $1 bill back, and he give the second fellow a glass of beer and 90 cents change. So then the 2 fellows went on a talking and laughing, but Jack was counting his money, and he seen something was wrong. So he says, boys, I made a little mistake in your change. The town fellows thought about it a minute, and then one of them says, yes, you took a nickel out of my friend's $1, and you took a dime out of my $1. That makes 15 cents for the 2 beers, and 2 beers is only 10 cents, so you owe us a nickel. Jack begun to scratch his head again, and the town fellow says, oh, never mind, what's a nickel between friends? You can keep the change, he says. And then the 2 fellows went out the door, and he could hear them laughing away down the street. Poor Jack, he sat there a long time studying on it and counting his money. He knowed he was 95 cents short, but he couldn't figure out how them town fellows done it so slick. On the 3rd day, a town girl come in, and she says, I'm in a big hurry, and my father is very sick, and he sent me after a pint of Razorback wine, and it cost 75 cents. And she throwed a $20 bill on the bar. Jack handed down the bottle and give her $19.25 change. There must be some mistake, she says. I only give you a $1 bill. Jack looked in the drawer right quick. No, ma'am, it's 20, says he. The pretty girl opened her little pocketbook again. My goodness, she says, I must have pulled out Pappy's $20 bill by accident. Give me the 20 back and take the wine out of this. And she throwed a $1 bill on the bar. Jack gave her back the $20 bill, and out of the door she went. She was in such a hurry she forgot her 25 cents change. Jack stood there a minute with a quarter in his hand, and he says to himself, well, it is a shame to shortchange a pretty girl like that, but I am 25 cents ahead anyhow. And then he got to thinking and counted the money in the drawer again. He was $19 short. And this time Jack seen just how the town girl done it, so he run out in the street to catch her, but she was plumb out of sight. On the 4th day, Jack sold the saloon back to the fellow he bought it from. 3 days of saloon keeping is all I could stand, says he. Them town people as nimble as a weasel and crooked as a barrel of snakes, and the women is worse than the men. In a couple days more, they would have got the gold filling out of my teeth, he says. So then Jack went back to the farm where he ought to have stayed in the first place, and that's the end of the story. So that's a Jack story. What do you see? I mean, that's another common sort of type of story. What's the moral of that story, do you think? For people telling it in the Ozarks.
Stay on the farm.
Could be stay on the farm. That's where you belong. Could be something else maybe. Be careful in town. Don't get hornswoggled. City people are wily. So be on the lookout when you go to town. Probably something to do with that. And it could very well be we country people have a place, and it's here on the farm, and let's just stay here and we won't get took by all the the Weasley city people out there. But that's again, that's a theme that you would see in a lot of these. And we'll take a quick look at an Ozark version of Jack and the Beanstalk. And this is it's pretty interesting because this is not Vance Randolph deciding to sit down and write, okay, we've got this famous story that everybody knows, let's just Ozark it up and change, beanstalk to cornstalk or whatever. This is a story that he heard somebody in the Ozarks telling. And this is back in the day before Walt Disney and cartoons came along and kind of reintroduced us to Jack and the Beanstalk. This was the version that you would have heard in the Ozarks. And it was called The Big Old Giant. One time there was a boy who found a dead crow, and the crow had a funny looking grain of corn in his mouth. So I don't remember a dead crow in Jack and the Beanstalk, but we start off with a dead crow here. It was big as a walnut and blue instead of yellow. So the boy planted it down by the big bluff and poured a hatful of stump water on it. Maybe spunk water. It could be used for that. Next time he come that way, the corn had growed up big as a tree with regular bark on it and blade fodder hanging down 40 foot long. The boy couldn't see no tassel on account of the trees on top of the bluff, and he couldn't see no ears on the stalk neither. He went home and told the folks, but they just laughed and didn't pay no attention. So finally he says to himself, I'll go back and climb that there cornstalk if I never see the back of my neck. I'm not really sure what that phrase means, but it sounds like a good phrase. Well, he clumb and he kept on climbing right on up past the top of the bluff, but there wasn't no ears on the stalk yet. He got so high up he couldn't see nothing but clouds. After a while he come to a big pasture, so he got off the cornstalk to look around and stretch his legs. So we got a cornstalk, a pasture. This is the Ozark version. The grass in that pasture was 10 foot high, and there was buckbrush in it bigger than apple trees. Pretty soon he seen some monstrous big sheep. There was one old sheep had a fine brass bell on it, about the size of a molasses barrel. We don't know how big a molasses barrel is, but it's pretty big, I can imagine, on a giant sheep. The folks won't never believe this, says he to himself, without I take something back to show them. So he out with his knife and started to cut the bell off in the big sheep's neck. It took a long time to saw through the leather strap, pretty near a foot thick, but he finally done it. The bell was too heavy for him to lift, so he rolled it along on the ground and it kept a ringing. Just as he got to the edge of the big pasture, the boy heard a terrible loud hollering, and here come the big old giant that owned them sheep. He was maybe 30 foot high, and he was a waving a club big as a saw log. Well, when the boy seen this here giant a-coming, he just rolled the bell over the edge, and then he jumped onto the big cornstalk and slid down. The big old giant throwed the club, but it missed him. The boy was pretty near to the bottom when the old giant jumped on the cornstalk and started down after him. Just as the boy lit on the ground, the cornstalk broke off, and the old big giant come a-roaring down the mountain and busted open like a rotten apple. By the time the boy's folks got there, the big old giant was dead, and that was the end of him. The folks got the neighbors to help, and they went out and buried the big old giant in the night and never did tell no outsiders so as to keep down scandal. Not sure why they were worried about a scandal, but next winter, every family for miles around showed up with quilts and lap robes and saddle blankets made out of some mighty funny-looking wool. Nobody in the country ever seen cloth like that before, and the old-timers all say them things was made out of the big old giant's britches. Some berry pickers found the big sheep bell 4 miles up the creek. The boy's pappy wanted to put it in the new church house, but the preacher says a bell like that was not made with human hands, and maybe it was the devil's work. And he says good Christian people better not ring that bell because who knows what might come a-running. So they just left the big sheep bell there in the brush where it fell, and it's still laying there to this day. So I like that version. That's a pretty exciting version of Jack and the cornstalk. So, but it's there are several of the Jacktails just in this one volume, and they were very common in the Ozarks when Randolph was collecting these stories, mainly from the 20s into the 40s is when he was collecting these stories. So it's been a long time ago, but we like to think that some of those stories survive in the oral tradition out there somehow. The hoop snake story survives. Some of these stories probably survive, and maybe some of the Jacktails. Now there were other stories as well. A lot of the Ozark Folktales were humorous. Probably most of the stories in Who Blowed Up the Church House and the other books that Randolph published were humorous stories. And as dark as the macabre stories were, you've got to think you need about 3 humorous ones just to balance one of the dark stories out, with babies being skint and that kind of stuff. But a lot of them were funny, and a lot of the funner ones to read. Now, these two, She Always Answered No and Little Abe and the Scalding Barrel, are examples of humorous stories that have European origins. The types are common in European folktelling tradition. They both also have sexual connotations, and we'll read Little Abe and the Scalding Barrel just because it's kind of typical of a lot of these stories. And as Randolph himself points out in his book, a lot of the stories he collected he wasn't able to publish until the 70s. Until after the sexual revolution and after things had kind of loosened up in society. And so this was one of the cleaner versions. One time there was a fellow they called Little Abe, and he used to go see other men's wives while their husband was not home. This is a very common theme. Men sneaking around, women sneaking around on their spouses. One night he heard somebody open the gate, and the woman says, "That's my old man." Abe knew he would not get out of the house in time, so he hid in the scalding barrel. When the man come in, it was not the woman's husband, but just another fellow tomcatting around, and his name was Big Jim. So this woman apparently just invited anyone in who came down the road. Abe sat in the barrel, still as a mouse. He could not see nothing, but he sure heard a plenty. After a while, the gate slammed again, and this time it was the woman's husband sure enough, and he walked right in. Big Jim spoke up and says, "Howdy, neighbor. I just come over to borrow your scalding barrel." The woman's husband did not like the look of things, but he says, "All right, Jim, there it is over in the corner." When Big Jim picked up the barrel, he took note it was mighty heavy, but he figured this wasn't no time to argue about the heft of a scalding barrel. So he just took off with it and never did stop till he was pretty near a mile down the road. "My goodness," says he, when he finally had to sit down and rest a minute, "I sure did get out of that mess mighty slick." About that time, Little Abe come a-crawling out of the barrel. "You sure did, Jim," he says, "and I didn't do too terrible bad myself." So that's, again, that's a very common story. You look at a lot of these folk tales, and we've got people being killed off, babies butchered, lots and lots of cheating spouses and stuff like that. And, it just makes you wonder about our ancestors. What in the world was going on back there? We tend to think of them as sort of buttoned down, life was boring, not much going on. But the folk tales tell a different story, a lot of that. She Always Answered No is a very common type of story where a dad tells his daughter that to answer every time a boy asks you a question, say no. And so we kind of know what that's about, and it's about a young man who's trying to court this girl, and she keeps saying no to everything he asks, and he goes and seeks advice from this woman who basically teaches him how to trick the girl, and he asks her questions that she shouldn't be saying no to, but she does anyway, and the end result is they end up getting married, and the guy says, "Well, if he's smart enough to trick my daughter in this way, then he's probably going to be smart enough to be a good husband." And you see several versions of that kind of story where the girl is tricked, or the father is convinced by his daughter's suitor that he's suitable because he's smart. He's kind of outsmarted the farmer, or he's outsmarted the girl, or something like that. And I thought we'd look at a couple. We've talked about some of these folk traditions, the dumb supper, no respect for the for the Dead is about a chivalry. Okay, and this is one where again a characteristic of this Ozarks rural humor that mines humor out of otherwise kind of dark situations. You know, so many of these stories are dark, and some of them are dark and funny. And this is one of those that's dark with kind of a punchline at the end of it. It says, one time there was an old man lived way up the creek, and all of a sudden his wife died. He had a passel of children to be took care of, and he didn't fool away no time a courting. Before the wagon tracks was out of the yard, he married a widow woman that lived down the road a piece. Some say he married her just one day after his wife's funeral. Most of the neighbors thought the old man ought to have waited a week or two just for the looks of the thing. But folks didn't blame him much because they all knowed he had to get somebody to see after the children. People was hell on chivalries in them days, and if a fresh married couple wasn't chivalried, it meant that they didn't have no standing in the community and was kind of looked down on. Everybody wanted to do the right thing by this here family, so they all come over to the house right after dark. Some was ringing bells, and some was shooting off guns, and some was just hollering loud as they could. Sounds like a chivalry that we talked about earlier in the semester. One fellow had brought an old circle saw, and he was hammering on it with a cold chisel. Everybody knows that when folks are being chivalry, they're supposed to set up something for the crowd. Mostly, they invite the people into the house and feed them cake or pie or whatever they've got. Lots of new married couples have chicken and fixins cooked up and a fine table all set for the chivalry party. And sometimes the husband has got a jug of corn squeezins hid somewhere outside where the men folks can take a little snort just for luck. And maybe there's a fiddler in the crowd so they can have a regular square dance right then and there. Anyhow, at least a couple can do is pass out candy and cigars or something like that. This old fellow was pretty well to do, but he was terrible close with his money. And he was not in no mood for jollification anyhow, because of one thing and another. Jollification, that's a good one, isn't it? Pretty soon he come out on the porch in his nightshirt looking mighty sour. "What's the matter with you folks?" says he. "Ain't you got no respect for the dead?" Well, sir, that chivalry party was so set back, they didn't know what to do. You could have heard a pin drop. Finally, they took their guns and cowbells and walked out of the old man's yard. The fellow that fetched the circle saw just left it a-laying there and shuffled on after the other folks with his mouth open and the cold chisel still in his hand. There wasn't a word spoke till they got away down the road. Then somebody began to giggle, and a minute later they was all laughing like fools. Some folks say you could hear them hooping and hollering clear over to the new highway. It all happened a long time ago, but there's still a few old-timers around here that ain't forgot that chivalry. Again, this is the storyteller. He's telling this as the gospel truth. And they'll bust out laughing to this day when something happens to put them in the mind of it. So, again, it's a very subtle kind of humor. Ain't you got no respect for the dead? The old widower says, you know, one day after his wife's died, he's remarried. But this is, again, pretty typical of the kind of humor. The Dumb Supper is not a humorous story. It's kind of an ominous sort of story where, remember we talked about the Dumb Supper where the girls would prepare a meal, and the idea was that you would see some sort of vision or apparition of the man that you would marry. And this particular Dumb Supper and this story could have been found in a lot of different places. They see this apparition of a guy in a cowboy hat with spurs and breeches tucked into his boots, you know, cowboy apparition. And one of the knives from one of the table settings was missing when they turned the lights back on. And years later, one of the girls ends up marrying this cowboy from the Indian Territory, and eventually he stabs her and kills her with the knife that went missing that night from the table. But that was, again, kind of a scary, spooky ghost story. And you notice that women are usually getting the short end of things in these stories. It's usually women getting killed or killing their babies or something like that. Getting their heads chopped off, you know, that sort of. And now he collected these stories from both men and women. And one of the things that Randolph points out is that men and women both told folk tales, but the tall tale tradition was almost exclusively a male tradition. What Randolph found was that most women that he met in the Ozarks considered tall tales just to be silly. That's stuff that men do, crazy stuff, and that really didn't fit into women's idea of humor. But women did tell folk tales, and he collected these from both men and women. But again, all of these had some sort of origins, European origins. Now, there are some of these that could have been local tales. One about a local man from southwest Missouri who gets elected to the state legislature and goes to Jefferson City and falls asleep during one of the debates and wakes up thinking that they're still on a previous topic when they moved on to a new topic and a new bill, and what he ends up doing is basically standing up and making an impassioned speech defending prostitutes, not knowing. He thought he was defending people who seined fish, and if you know what a seine is, you know, the net that you pull through a creek or a river. But that one's meant to be funny, and I don't know if there was really a Deacon Spurlock who went to Jeff City or not. Another one, the tourist that went too far, and this one actually references Salcoon Mountain. Remember last week's class we talked about one of our Ozark words was Salcoon, and we talked about Salcoon Mountain down in Stone County. And in that story, the teller actually sets it in Stone County, Kimberling City, and talks about a tourist from Chicago who comes down and basically gets on everybody's nerves, does this and that, and everybody, and until finally somebody from up the creek beats the tar out of him at a bar in Kimberling City. And it's a funny story. I guess if you're not a tourist from Chicago, it's a funny story. But it's one of several tourist stories, folk tales that Randolph collected. And these were all pretty much, they were sometimes newer versions on old themes, but these were relatively new stories because tourism was a relatively new thing at the time he was collecting these stories. And then there are some other common story types like the Three Little Pigs, the Three Wishes, all of these kind of folk tale types that we're familiar with. And I thought the last one we might look at is just that the Ozark version of the Three Little Pigs, if I can find it. And it's just called, it is called Three Little Pigs. And again, just to show you that in the 19th century and into the 20th century, different regions, even different subregions within the Ozarks had their own varieties, their own versions of these popular folk tales that we all know. Today, in our more homogenized society, we all kind of we inherit the same stories because we're reading the same little golden books or watching the same cartoons, and we get these stories from Bugs Bunny or Walt Disney or whatever. But in these days, you know, you would have found a variety of stories that were all related. And this is the last one I think we'll look at. One time there was 3 little pigs. One pig built him a chip house, one built him a stick house, and one built him a rock house. So we get chip house instead of a straw house in this one. When the old fox come to the chip house, and it's a fox instead of a wolf in this story, he says, "Let me in, piggy wee. If you don't, I'll puff and I'll blow till I blow your house down." But the little pig was afeared, and he wouldn't open the door. So the old fox, he puffed and he blowed till the house fell down, and then he ate the little pig up. The next day, the old fox come to the stick house, and he says, "Let me in, piggy wee. If you don't, I'll puff and I'll blow till I blow your house down." But the little pig was afeared, and he wouldn't open the door. So the old fox, he puffed and he blowed till the house fell down, and then he ate the little pig up. Finally, the old fox come to the rock house, and he says, "Let me in, piggy wee. If you don't, I'll puff and I'll blow till I blow your house down." But the little pig was afeared, and he wouldn't open the door. So the old fox, he puffed and he blowed, but the rock house wouldn't fall down. Then the old fox says, "Let me get the end of my nose in." And the little pig opened the door a crack. this makes no sense to me that he would do that, but he does. Then the old fox says, let me get a little more of my nose in. And the little pig opened the door another crack. Then the old fox says, let me get my eyes in. And the little pig opened the door another crack. Then the old fox says, let me get a little more of my eyes in. And the little pig opened the door another crack. Not a smart pig here we're dealing with. Then the old fox says, let me get my ears in. And the little pig opened the door another crack. And so it went, with the old fox getting a little more of his ears in, then his neck, and a little more of his neck, then his front feet, and a little more of his front feet, then his ribs, and a little more of his ribs. Finally, the old fox was all inside the house but his tail, and then he just busted on in without asking the little pig nothing. Next, the old fox sat down by the fire, and he says, warm belly gut, eat a pig pretty soon. Just then they heard the hounds a-coming around the mountain, and the old fox says, Piggy wee, where can I hide? And the little pig says, jump in that big trunk. So the old fox jumped in the big trunk, and Piggy wee slammed down the lid and locked it. The little pig, he sat and thought a while. Then he got some hot water out of the kettle and poured it through a little hole. And the old fox says, Piggy wee, there's a flea a-biting me. Then the little pig poured in some more water, and the old fox says, Piggy wee, there's a fire burning me. Then the little pig poured in the whole kettle of hot water, and the old fox hollered something terrible, but it didn't do him no good. Pretty soon the old fox was scalded plumb to death, and the little pig lived happy in his rock house till the butcher cut him down. So, nobody gets a happy ending in that except the butcher, I guess, or whoever got to eat the pork that Piggy wee made. But it's a different version than you're used to with the three little pigs, with a whole extra kind of act two in there with the pig tricking the fox into the trunk and then getting revenge on the fox. What happens to the wolf anyway in the one that we usually hear?
I think he goes down a chimney. The one I read is he goes down a chimney into like a pot of boiling water.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that sounds right. Yeah, he couldn't blow the house down, and in that version, the pig wouldn't open the door to let him squeeze in there. So I think that sounds right. Yeah, he tries to sneak down the chimney, a la Santa Claus, and doesn't come out all that good. But so you still get the boiling, scalding water version there. It's just a different kind. But it's I think in a lot of ways it's sort of sad to think that tradition is for the most part lost. We don't inherit those versions of the stories anymore, and it's just like so many things. As the country becomes more connected, as we all become more connected to each other in different regions, different cities, different places, we become homogenized. And it's that way with everything, whether it's business or music or any number of things. Walmart takes over, and the mom and pop stores and the local variety sort of disappears, and it's that way with the homogenization of folk tales. We still have them. We sort of share them more nationally now, certain versions of them. But you can still you can still read these stories, and that's the beauty of Randolph's books, is they're still there. It's kind of more like reading history now, because all those informants that he had are dead and have been dead for years. They were all old people in the 20s and 30s and 40s when he was talking with them. But it's good that he saved those stories and that they haven't completely disappeared. There are all kinds of other stories too. I mean, they're just the three little pigs that we just read represents two different types, kind of combined together. Two different types going back to European traditions. The blow in the house in type. That's the name of one type, blow in the house in, and the other one is the victim tricked to enter the box type. So apparently there are lots of stories where something, an animal or a person is tricked into getting into a box and then locked in a box, and probably the outcome is not going to be good for the person inside the box. But this version of Three Little Pigs combines those two types of stories. There are lots of other stories. There are stories. Has anybody ever heard the story of the camp meeting? We talked about camp meetings when we talked about religion in the Ozarks. The camp meeting where the mischievous boys switched the babies in the wagons. You've heard that one? That's one of the most common stories. But the story is that they were at a camp meeting. We talked about camp meetings, all these wagons around and stuff. And it was the last day of the camp meeting. They were going to go through preaching and all that kind of stuff. And then everybody was going to go home and scatter off back, to wherever they came from. And these boys got together and decided there were several wagons where there were babies sleeping in them. And they switched the babies from one wagon to the next, and the people got in there and headed home. And a lot of them got home before they realized that the baby in their wagon wasn't their baby. And then it took them several weeks to figure out, to get them all back to where they belonged, because this was in the 1800s and people were, limited to wagon or horseback travel. But I've heard that one. That one seems to have a strong kind of Texas connection. It may have happened down there at some point, but a friend of mine from Texas told me he heard that one when he was growing up. It was told as one of his family stories. We could be related. I'm not sure, but I heard. So I've heard that one. There's another common one. The fella, and this is another story that I heard older family members of mine tell about the guy who steals corn, and somebody in here may have heard that one too. This farmer kept noticing that the corn was disappearing from his corn crib. Remember we talked about corn cribs? And he had tried putting a lock on the outside of the door of his corn crib, and it kept disappearing. So he finally decides, well, I'm going to put a trap, like a steel trap, a wolf trap or something, inside my corn crib and see what happens. And sure enough, the next morning they hear somebody hollering out in the corn crib, and he goes out there, and there's a guy standing there with his arm squeezed in between two of the logs. Remember, on barns and corn cribs and stuff like that, they didn't chink in the middle. So his arm was skinny enough, he got it in there. And he'd got his arm stuck in a trap, but he couldn't get it back out with that trap on it. And the story goes that the farmer, the story in Randolph goes that the farmer invited two of his neighbors over, and they sort of talked it over, and we're having a conversation as if the guy wasn't even standing there. What do you think? Who do you think's been getting the corn? All that kind of stuff. It's a little funnier. The story that I heard, which is the end of that story too, is that the farmer, instead of whipping the guy or taking him to the sheriff or something like that, takes him inside, feeds him breakfast, goes back out after breakfast is over, fills up a big sack of corn, gives it to him, and sends him on his way, and says, I don't think I'll be missing any of my corn anymore. And the guy gets the message and cleans up his act and all that kind of stuff. And that's similar to the version in Randolph as well. And that's another family story that I heard as a family story. I don't know, who it happened to. It probably happened to somebody somewhere, and then it became everybody's family folk tale for a while. So it's just one of many stories like that you hear that are still floating around in some families. And we don't have time to go into really any of these, but one of the things I'll just mention is that there are common topics. Some topics in Ozarks history have generated more folk tales than others. As you can imagine, the Civil War has generated lots of family stories, lots of legends and tales. Some of them true, some of them not so much. Some of them probably, a combination of truth and legend. Lots and lots of Indian legends in the Ozarks. And even in Randolph's books, there are several of the folk tales that have to do with Indian legends. And lots of lost treasure stories. That's a favorite in the Ozarks. And that's a lot of the lost treasure stories are still around. And that's just a favorite human story, the story of lost treasures. That goes way back into European origins as well. the fascination with wealth, coming upon this great wealth. In the Ozarks, sometimes the lost treasure dates all the way back to De Soto and the Spanish explorers. Sometimes it's Civil War related. Some Confederate officer had a cache of gold or something and buried it in a cave somewhere and then got killed. There's the legend of the Yoakum silver down in southwest Missouri, the cave where the Yoakum supposedly made their silver dollars, their counterfeit silver money, and then it caved in and nobody knows where it is. And so you get lots of those lost treasure stories. When I was a kid, there was a guy who lived somewhere in our county, at least I remember people talking about him, who apparently didn't seem to have any job. He just spent his time looking for some kind of lost treasure that he thought had been hidden in the hills along White River somewhere. And who knows, he may have found it and snuck off in the night somewhere. I don't know whatever happened to the guy. But other stories, a very common story involving a real life animal and not a hickle snoopus or a bing buffer or anything like that. The story of the baby snatching panther, or painter, as Ozarkers would have called the panthers. And these, again, are cougars or mountain lions that people in the Ozarks called panthers. You see a lot of stories, or you used to see and hear lots of stories about panthers that would sneak into houses and steal babies and take them off and eat them or do whatever a panther does with a baby. And it probably happened once, I guess, and became just a widespread legend, folk tale. But it may have happened. A lot of people believe that panthers could smell babies, that they were attracted by babies crying, and there are lots of stories about panthers scratching on doors and stuff. And it almost always happens when the man is away somewhere and the woman's and the baby's at home. And you get these kind of, it's a type of story that you probably would have had wolves in the European versions. In the Ozarks, you replace wolves with panthers, just as we replaced the wolf with a fox in the Three Pig story. But lots of panther stories, and we won't go into to these others, but these are just lots of different kinds of stories that you can still hear today, folk tales, that kind of stuff. Does anybody have any questions about folk tales before we bring it into our tale telling?